Hey, everybody, welcome to our virtual Bible study. Thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate it. It is super encouraging for us, and we hope for you as well. Tonight is lesson number 2 in our new study of the book of Proverbs. Now, we're not doing all chapters verse by verse, but we are doing a topical study of the book of Proverbs under the general heading of Wisdom for Life, which means that we're heading toward, I think, really practical studies in the book of Proverbs. Very, very subject oriented studies in the book of Proverbs. And we're just laying the groundwork right now. So, this is lesson number 2 in our study of the book of Proverbs. Before we go any further, may I encourage you to please, if you're on our YouTube channel, go down right below the video and hit that subscribe button. Please do us a favor by doing that. We aren't monetized. We don't make money off of this. The Lord has a way of funding His work. It comes through the contribution on the first day of the week. That's what the saints provide in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. So we're not asking for your money. We're not doing that at all. We want to provide this content to as many people as possible. And to help us to do that, hit the subscribe button. It helps us to be more visible on YouTube, and that's a good thing. If you are on Facebook, the most important thing you can do on Facebook is share the video on your timeline. The way Facebook works, we are a public page, which means that we don't send out or accept friend requests because we're a public page. So the only way that somebody can see our content is if it's shared on your timeline, and then they go on and they like our page, which means they're now following us on Facebook. And the only way to get this to them is for you to put it on your timeline so that your friends can see what you're watching and maybe pique some interest. And we hope that is what you do, to share the video on your timeline. And then imagine that we present a lesson and 100 people share it to their 100 friends, and generally people have more than that. And now you're talking about, thousands and thousands of people who have access to a video that started in one spot and, like a chain reaction, got shared throughout Facebook. So please do that. Please share the video on your timeline. It doesn't take any effort to do that, and it would help a lot. Okay, so this is lesson number 2. Lesson number 1 was essentially an introduction to wisdom, and we're doing the same tonight. This is an introduction to wisdom part 2, but this is lesson number 2, and our focus is going to be just a tad bit different in this lesson than it was in the last lesson. Lesson number 1 was more a definition of wisdom. What is wisdom? I understand, it's experience, but it's a whole lot more than that, because in the Bible, as we explored in lesson number 1, the Bible has more shades of meaning to the idea of wisdom. And tonight we're talking about the practical value of that. What are the benefits of accepting wisdom, or what are the consequences of rejecting it? So our study tonight is really simple. There's not it's just essentially not a huge chunk of the Bible that we're trying to get. It's just really essentially we're focusing on the benefits of wisdom and the consequences of rejecting it. Now, I think this should help us transition pretty well into the topical lessons that we have coming up, because the advice that's being given in Proverbs, we can say, now, wait a minute, what did we learn back in lesson number 2? Oh, okay. If I accept this, there's a lot of benefits for accepting this advice from Scripture, and there's a lot of consequences that come from rejecting this advice. So we're trying to make it really practical. For this lesson number 2, we want to focus on chapter 1, chapter 2 of Proverbs, maybe chapter 3, some of chapter 4, and maybe a little bit from chapter 8. And you should take the time to read those, right, where you have a real emphasis just on the principle of wisdom. And you start getting some, especially in chapter 2, near the end of chapter 2, you start getting some practical advice, but they're more illustrations than anything. And then beyond that, you start getting into the subject matters, where he's starting to address subject matters within the book, which is what we're going to do starting in lesson number 3. So I would encourage you to read the chapters. Look at chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, chapter 8 along with that, and just think about how he's presenting wisdom and whether or not it's valuable to human life. That would be my advice, to spend some time doing that. We can't do that tonight. We don't have the time to do it. in this particular lesson, lesson number 2. All right, before we do that, before we look at benefits, and we'll spend most of our time on benefits, turn to chapter 1. Go down with me to verse 20. Turn to Proverbs chapter 1. Look at verse 20. All right, so Proverbs 1, look at verse 20. I'll read verse 20 and 21. Wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief concourses, at the openings of the gates in the city. She speaks her words. Okay, powerful verse, because what it tells us is that wisdom is available to anybody. It's not limited just to a certain segment of people. Wisdom is for everybody. God wants people to be wise, right? We'll talk about this in the next lesson. It would transform nations if we practiced just a little bit of wisdom when it came to our decisions. But wisdom is available to everybody. So wisdom is universal in scope. God intends for everybody to use it. But it's conditioned upon our acceptance of it. So while it is available to all, it's not being used by everybody because it has to be accepted by man and used accordingly. Now, because of this, not everybody is receiving wisdom, which is what we just said, right? So if people aren't listening to it, then there are a lot of people who aren't receiving it. And the answer to that would be back in verse 7 of chapter 1 when he says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." So if a person does not have the fear of the Lord, respect for God, then they're not going to be in tune with wisdom. They're not going to accept it. They won't receive it. They don't regard it. It means nothing to them if they don't first have respect for the Lord. So that is why in this passage in verse 22, Proverbs 1 verse 22, he'll talk about some categories of folks that are rejecting wisdom. How long, you simple ones, there's one category, will you love simplicity? Right? There's nothing wrong with something being simple, but it's not quite the meaning here, because he's talking about simple ones, but they love where they're at in their mind. For scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. So there's 3 categories here. The simple ones, these are the people that are, by definition, they are easily misled. They are, we would say gullible. These are gullible people. They don't practice common sense. And apparently in verse 22, they love the simplicity, right? They sort of like being in that position where they're just being led along by every idea of other people. Those are people that do not receive wisdom. They reject wisdom. In the same passage, he talks about scorners, right? Scorners. These are mockers. And then he talks about fools. Fools are people who follow their own heart, because in Proverbs 28:26, he says, "The man that trusts in his own heart is a fool." So a fool is a person who trusts in his own heart. And these 3 categories of people reject wisdom. They don't want wisdom. And when this happens, when people reject wisdom, which, topically we'll start talking about these things, and you can see this in real life. You can see when people don't do these things, when they're not wise with money, or when they're loose with their associations in life, or they're loose with their lips and they hurt and injure other people, people can't say, "Well, I wasn't warned about the consequences of it," because the writer of Proverbs is saying when you reject wisdom, there are serious consequences for rejecting wisdom. In fact, in Proverbs 1, look at verse 24. He said, "Because I called you and you refused," right, so there's the rejection of wisdom. He said, "I've stretched out my hand and no one regarded, because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke." Then he says, "I will also laugh at your calamity." Verse 26, "I will mock when your terror comes." We use the term, "who got the last laugh?" We use that phraseology. This is wisdom getting the last laugh, so to speak. Now, God is not delighted that people are injured by their terrible choices, but it is a way of saying that we always suffer the consequences of our own choices. It's a way of God saying, I warned you about this. You were sufficiently warned. You're eating the fruit of your own choices. And so it's sort of like wisdom has the last laugh here. If you look in the Proverbs, which we'll do in our studies individually, topically, and you look at a wise course of action versus an unwise course of action, or the rejection of wisdom, the Bible will constantly say there's wonderful treasure to be found in being wise about your choices, and there are devastating consequences for being a fool. If you want to really contrast it, well, in fact, look at chapter 1. Chapter 1, look at verse 31 and 32. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their own way, and be filled to the full with their own fancies. So you reap what you sow. That's what the Bible's saying. For the turning away of the simple will slay them. The complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will dwell safely and will be secure without fear of evil. Okay, so the Bible is sufficiently warning us. Please listen to wisdom. It'll save you a lot of heartache in life. Okay. So, only 2 points tonight. Number 1, what are the benefits of wisdom? Number 2, what are the consequences of rejecting it? And this is not exhaustive, right? I understand, I get it, that we could literally go through Proverbs and other wisdom literature, like Psalms and some other passages. Ecclesiastes could be included within that. And we could build, a list of 10 pages worth of bulleted points on each of these as to the consequences or benefits of rejecting or accepting wisdom respectively, right? So we could do that. I just want to sort of center our thoughts on these early chapters in Proverbs. And even then, it's not completely 100%, but it's just major points being made by the writer. So what are some benefits of wisdom? Well, one benefit of wisdom is that it brings us closer to our God. And we want to be close to our God, don't we? So it brings us closer to our God and reminds us of God's care and protection for us. Look at chapter 2. I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. Proverbs 2, verses 1 through 7. This is a benefit. And listen to how a wise man is brought closer to God and receives God's care and his protection. Okay, verse 1. My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding. Yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield. That's really important. He is a shield to those who walk uprightly. All right, so in these verses, it speaks of the protection of God. And of course, this is to a person, Proverbs 1:7, who fears the Lord, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, wisdom, understanding. It's the beginning of all of it. So a person who doesn't respect God is not going to listen even to his practical counsel. But wisdom brings us closer to God and reminds us of God's care and protection for us. I remember Psalm 84, verse 11, where he says, no good thing will he withhold from those who walk uprightly. That's providential protection, right? He's making sure that they're shielded from bad things in life. That's not to say that there won't be bad things in life, but it is to say that God protects us from things that might be faith-destroying circumstances, right? Not that you can't endure hard times, but there is a hedge of blessings he puts around his people, which comes through wisdom. In Proverbs 2 and verse 7, he calls it a shield. In Proverbs 20, looking at that chapter, Proverbs 20 and verse 5, he says this, counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out, right? The idea is that they are protected, they are insulated by wisdom, and God does that. So God protects us through wisdom. He saves us from some heartaches in life. There's some pain that he's able to protect us from through wisdom. There's some tragedy that we don't have to experience if we use wisdom. So it's a way of God protecting us. If you practice wisdom and you don't ever drink alcohol and drive in a car, God's going to protect you from a world of heartache, either by injuring yourself or by killing someone else or by trouble with the law. you see how God is protecting people through wise decisions? He does that. His wisdom aims at the best for us. It aims at the best for us. Here's the second one. Wisdom gives us access to the providence of God. And now it's not just simply protection, but these are the blessings that God can put in our life through wisdom. Proverbs 2, look at verse 8. He guards the paths of justice and preserves the way of his saints. He guards the path of justice, right? Or I should say paths of justice. He guards those. Men don't always do the right thing in this world. I mean, that's for sure. And sometimes we don't always do the right thing. We don't always act right. But right and wrong are still preserved by God. Love still exists. Kindness is still, something embedded within the fabric of our creation. Truth telling is still optimal and preferred. I mean, these are eternal principles that are embedded within creation because, his nature, his creation reflects his nature. These are things that are objectively good, and he guards those things as such. It's always been wrong to kill and lie and steal and things of that sort. And people that walk in his ways, he preserves them. He watches for them because in verse 8, right, he preserves the way of the saints. So if you're doing good, there are blessings that come from doing good in the exercise of this practical wisdom like we're studying the book of Proverbs. So wisdom gives us access to the providence of God. God cares for his people, and one of the ways he does that, one of the ways he provides for them, is through wise decisions. Number 3, wisdom gives us the ability to navigate moral issues in life. Proverbs 2 and verse 9 says this, then will you understand righteousness, right? So if you're practicing wisdom, you gain insight into righteousness. There's a connection between righteousness and those decisions. Justice, equity, and every good path. Righteousness means what is right. Justice means the ability to decide a case. It's talking about judgment, your discernment in matters. Equity means fairness or what is peaceful. And then every good path, which is sort of like, and everything closely associated with those principles. Obviously, there are some people, some choices where you make some choices with people that don't really have a moral connection, right? I just think of this off the top of my head. Our kids have homework when they come home from school, and they're given a series of choices about a math problem. Okay, so I get that that's not really a moral choice, right? So if you get the wrong answer, that's not a condemnatory wrong answer. If you meant to circle the letter B and you should have circled number A on a reading assignment, okay, that's not necessarily a moral choice, but almost all decisions beyond those types of things have moral consequences to them. The way you handle money, what your aims are, and what you do, your behavior, like when you're dating somebody, your speech, what you say and how you say it, your associations, your use of time, those all have moral connection. So many choices in life require wisdom because they are morally centered. And wisdom is a way of navigating through the moral issues of life. So, you have word from God, and then you have the application of the word from God. And wisdom is what helps us legislate the application of God's word. So there's a lot of moral choices in life. Wisdom helps us with that. In Proverbs 2, verses 12 to 19, wisdom keeps us from being truly injured by evil people. It can even insulate us from the actions of other people who have wicked intent. So look at this. What you do is you have a principle and then you have an illustration in Proverbs 2. I think I mentioned it earlier that you start getting some illustrations of this sort of bigger picture stuff. So verse 12, to deliver you from the evil way, from the man who speaks perverse things. Now watch, he's saying, it'll keep you from the wrong path, but it'll keep you from the people trying to take you down the wrong path. Right? Verse 12. So then he says, from those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. Wisdom can keep you from going with those folks. Verse 14, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perversity of the wicked. So there are a lot of people that just love doing wicked stuff, and wisdom can keep you from the associations that might drag you down that same path. Well then, verse 15, you have the same, whose ways are crooked, who are devious in their paths. So you get an illustration in verse 16. to deliver you from the immoral woman. And she's going to pop up often in the book of Proverbs. So the immoral woman, the seductress who flatters with her words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house leads down to death, and her paths to the dead. None who go to her will return, or they regain the paths of life. So he's warning us, and an example of that would be like a soliciting woman trying to get us to do really bad things, right? And so he's illustrating, saying that's an example of a bad person. Wisdom can keep you from that kind of associations. To deliver implies that evil people are trying to ensnare us. And that's what he says in verse 12, right? To deliver you from that. So a trap is being laid by these evil people that are trying to pull you down, make you do bad things. And then wisdom has the ability to snatch us up out of that. And I think I would probably do some study. We'll do this as we go through, but just do some preliminary type of study on this sort of seductress, because you'll see her in chapter 5 of Proverbs and some other chapters. And the plea of the book is don't fall into that trap. Be wise. Think through. Look at the end of your actions. Project that. And then stay away, because you know that there's only bad stuff that can follow as a result of that. So wisdom keeps us from being truly injured by evil people. Wisdom also helps us to be faithful to God. And that's what we all want, right? To be faithful to God. In Proverbs chapter 2, verses 20 and 21, he says, so if you avoid all that, so you may walk in the way of goodness and keep to the paths of righteousness, for the upright will dwell in the land and the blameless will remain in it. That's what we want. We want, verse 20, to walk in the way of goodness. We want our relationship with God to be stronger, and it can be through exercise of good wisdom. Wisdom is goodness. It is righteousness. That's why we want to practice it. It's very beneficial for life. Now, if we were to branch out and go beyond and go into chapter 3, I just jotted down a bunch of bullet points from chapter 3. Let me give you 5 of the ones I wrote down. And I didn't invent these. They're in the text. So I'm just pointing out what's in the text. So it's not like I'm profound and I'm really smart because I've figured out something no one else has ever seen. It's all been right here the whole time. We're just simply noting it, okay? So I'm going to give you the 5 out of my list of things that I saw in chapter 3. Additional benefits of wisdom. One is this. In verse 2 and in verse 8, wisdom can help protect your physical life and even add years to your life. Real quick, he says in verse 2, for length of days and long life and peace, they will add to you. Right? So if you don't make really dumb choices in life, which wisdom would shield us from, there's a good chance I'll live longer. Number 2, it gives us a good reputation among our peers, right? So it builds community rapport. People start looking at us and they start saying, that's a really wise guy. He's got a lot of wisdom and maturity about him. Look at verse 4 of chapter 3. And so find favor and high esteem in the sight of God and men. That's what we want. We want mankind to be able to reflect back and say, you are a good decision maker. And we want God to say, I'm proud of the decisions you're making. This reminds me a lot of Luke 2:52. Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. There's wisdom, and look how he's growing. Part of it was his reputation among men, his social reputation. Number 3, God will give us greater opportunities. Look at verses 9 and 10 of chapter 3. Honor the Lord with your possessions and the first fruits of all your increase, so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. So the more you exercise wisdom, the more decisions you can handle properly, God will give you more decisions to make so that you can handle those properly too. That's like the parable in Matthew 25 of the talents, of the money, and about using opportunities wisely, and God will award us and reward us with greater opportunities. Number 4, a clean conscience. I love this. Look at verse 24. This has always been one of my favorite verses in Proverbs. I just think this. We often go to bed at night, do we not? Having made really dumb decisions, unwise decisions, and we regret those decisions. Look at verse 24. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. Yes, you will lie down and your sleep will be sweet. A great way of being able to have a good, restful night of sleep? Use wisdom. Make wise decisions because you have a clean conscience. Number 5, it keeps us from regret. You don't want to live a life of regret. In Proverbs 4, verses 1 through 4, he says, "Hear, my children, the instruction of a father, and give attention to know understanding." He says, "For I give you good doctrine, do not forsake my law. When I was my father's son, tender and the only one in the sight of my mother, he also taught me and said to me, let your heart retain my words, keep my commandments, and live." He's essentially saying, I've been in your shoes. I've been where you are, and I don't want you to make some of the same mistakes that I've made. You can avoid a life of regret by practicing good wisdom. Those are all benefits of wisdom. Isn't that wonderful? Don't you want to be wise? I do. I want to be wise. All right, so number 2, and I know we don't have much time. We're really almost out of time. Let me just run through, number 2, a list of some consequences of refusing wisdom. And essentially, it's the opposite of all that we just said. It pushes us away from God, removes us from the providence and protection of God. There's a tendency to make immoral decisions when we're not wise, and we become susceptible to the plots of evil people. We end up going along with them. We're not practicing wisdom. But there's just a couple that I want to point out really quickly. Proverbs 1, verse 32, foolishness or a lack of wisdom is destructive in nature. In Proverbs 1, listen to verse 32. For the turning away of the simple, it'll slay them, right? If you're not practicing wisdom, there's only one end to that. Heartache and trouble. That's what he's talking about. And he even says the complacency of fools will destroy them. So that's what he says in verse 32 of chapter 1. Also, it produces disloyalty to others. Now, I know it's part of an illustration he uses, but in chapter 2, verse 17, he's speaking of that seductress, the immoral woman, and he says of her, who forsakes the companion of her youth. But you put unwise people making decisions, and they won't be loyal to people long, because instead of being guided by God, they'll be guided by their heart. In Proverbs 2:17, there's unfaithfulness to God, because at the end of that it says, forgets the covenant of her God. They distance themselves from God. So much of that is because they're depending on self to make decisions. They're not using divine wisdom to help them through. In Proverbs 2, verses 18 and 19, foolishness leads to a destructive path with collateral damage. You hurt other people. Verse 18 of chapter 2, her house leads down to death, her paths to the dead. None who go to her to return, nor do they regain the paths of life. There's just a wake of destruction by unwise decisions. And then in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 16, refusing wisdom from God pushes us to trust more in ourselves and into many errors and mistakes, which I think we've emphasized previously. Now, I think between this lesson and the last one, that's telling us we had better listen to the advice God is giving on these subjects we're about to study. I can't wait. I'm super excited. So in the next lesson, we'll start our very first one, wisdom for the nations. That would include the United States of America. It includes Europe. It includes Russia. It includes Ukraine. Every single nation upon the face of God's green earth needs to heed wisdom for nations. And if we did, this world would overnight change. Be very, very different. So what is the wisdom for the nations? We'll find out in lesson number 3. Hope you'll come back and see us. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's an encouragement that you're here. Please like, please share these pages, please subscribe to the channel, do everything you can to help us. We appreciate it greatly. I want you to know before we come back next time, I love you. God loves you even more. And may God bless your studies until we come back. See you then. Bye.